At the UN General Assembly in New York, a packed hall full of world leaders and diplomats waited for their turn to speak on pressing global issues, including climate change, food security, and international cooperation. As the stage was set, Ibrahim Traoré, the young and charismatic president of Burkina Faso, stood poised. His presence was not just that of a rising leader from Africa but that of a symbol of resistance and self-sufficiency in a continent that had long been marked by external dependence. Adjusting the microphone, Traoré began his speech with calm determination. He wasn't there to offer empty promises or just talk about the usual topics of global cooperation. Instead, he shared an ambitious initiative that would transform not just his country but also redefine the relationship between Africa and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the nations of the world, he started, I would like to share an initiative that we are implementing in Burkina Faso. An initiative that seeks not only to transform our country but also to redefine relationships between people of Africa and the rest of the world. His words immediately captured the attention of the audience. It was a bold statement. The UN General Assembly was used to hearing from leaders who spoke about plans for change, but Traoré was offering more than that, he was offering a new paradigm. His speech wasn't just about addressing Africa's problems, but about taking ownership of the continent's future. He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing with a message that would echo through the hall. Traoré's speech took a more defining turn as he transitioned from general ideas to practical action. For decades, he began, many African countries have depended on foreign aid to ensure food security. He acknowledged the role of organizations like USAID, which had provided critical assistance to millions across the continent. However, Traoré was quick to challenge the status quo, posing a difficult but necessary question: does this help really free us, or does it perpetuate our dependence? The room fell silent. The question wasn't just rhetorical, it was a challenge to the entire global order that had shaped Africa's place in the world for decades. He didn't linger on the uncomfortable implications of this question but immediately turned to the solution his country was implementing. Traoré announced that Burkina Faso, with the help of its regional partners, was launching an innovative program called Rice for All. The goal was nothing short of revolutionary: to replace foreign food aid with locally produced food. Burkina Faso would start exporting rice to neighboring West African countries, replacing the food aid traditionally provided by international organizations, including USAID. The room was taken aback. Some delegates exchanged surprised looks, while others applauded hesitantly, unsure how to react to this shift in narrative. This initiative, as Traoré elaborated, was about more than agricultural production. It was about autonomy and dignity. His goal was clear: Africa must feed Africa. He wanted future generations of African children to grow up knowing that they could trust in their own land, their own work, and not external programs conditioned by foreign political interests. The program wasn't just about rice, it was about reshaping the African continent's entire relationship with itself and the world. As the speech drew to a close, Traoré offered a powerful message: external aid had its place, but it was not a permanent solution. True transformation, he concluded, begins when we take control of our destiny. The applause was deafening. Traoré had planted a flag on a contentious subject: self-sufficiency for Africa. The room buzzed with conversation, as the implications of his speech began to sink in. The speech left a lingering impact. Donald Trump, watching from afar, was visibly surprised and, perhaps, unsettled by the audacity of Traoré's words. As a man who had built his political career on the principle of pragmatism, Trump's worldview had always centered around maintaining U.S. influence over global affairs. Burkina Faso's president was challenging the very basis of that influence with his bold proposal. To Trump, the idea that an African nation might take control of its own future, without U.S. intervention, seemed almost unthinkable. What does he think he's doing? Trump muttered, frowning at the screen displaying Traoré's image. His advisors tried to explain that the Rice for All program wasn't meant to compete with USAID, but rather to promote African self-sufficiency. Yet, it was clear that Trump saw it as a direct challenge to American influence in the region. The U.S. had been a primary aid provider to Africa for decades, and now Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country, was calling for independence from that system. Back in New York, Trump summoned his advisors for an emergency meeting. He was angered by what he perceived as an insult to America's role in helping African nations. "We've helped these countries for years," Trump fumed. "Now they want to dispense with us." His advisors attempted to calm him, but the message Traoré had delivered was clear: Africa didn't need America's help to survive. It was a reckoning for Trump, who had always been the one to dictate terms of aid. Meanwhile, international media began to highlight the speech, with some outlets praising Traoré's boldness and vision. Political analysts were divided. Some saw it as a rhetorical flourish designed to get attention, while others speculated that it could be a game-changing initiative. The idea of African nations taking charge of their food security was unprecedented, and it sparked debates about whether the program could succeed or would be too idealistic to execute. As criticisms of the plan mounted, Traoré's calm and measured response remained unshaken. He continued to stress that Burkina Faso wasn't just throwing out aid, it was taking control of its destiny. He reiterated that his government was already seeing positive results from its community farms, and that agriculture was the key to the country's future. The program's potential to free Africa from foreign aid dependence was becoming clearer by the day, and Traoré's resolve was only strengthening. In the days following his speech, Traoré's resolve was tested. Critics were quick to attack the Rice for All program, questioning its feasibility and sustainability. Some economists argued that Burkina Faso lacked the necessary infrastructure to support such an ambitious initiative. Rice production was an enormous task, requiring massive investments in irrigation, machinery, and labor. Without these resources, the program could fail before it even got off the ground. But Traoré remained firm in his decision. In a press conference, he addressed the concerns head-on. He acknowledged the challenges but maintained that the vision was worth pursuing. "Yes, we know there are challenges," he said calmly, "but we also know that it is possible to overcome them." He pointed to the community farms that were already producing rice as evidence that progress was being made. The results, though modest, were promising, and Traoré knew that if they could expand on this momentum, the country could eventually achieve self-sufficiency. The more international media and critics attacked the program, the more Traoré dug in. He refused to back down from his belief that Africa needed to control its future. He called for greater regional cooperation, urging other African leaders to join him in promoting self-sufficiency across the continent. He recognized that it would take time, but he was convinced that this was a necessary step toward economic independence. Trump's response to the initiative was swift. He saw Traoré's words as a direct challenge to America's dominance in Africa and American aid programs. Trump ordered a strategic review of U.S. operations in Africa, directing his team to counter the rise of self-sufficiency movements on the continent. He was unwilling to let Burkina Faso's example gain traction and sought ways to reinforce U.S. influence. The diplomatic tension between Traoré's bold vision and Trump's resistance was becoming increasingly clear. But in the African Union, Traoré's initiative was met with enthusiastic support. Leaders from Mali, Ivory Coast, and other neighboring countries began to express interest in the Rice for All program. As African nations began to see the benefits of self-sufficiency, the movement gained traction beyond Burkina Faso. Traoré continued to visit neighboring countries to expand the initiative. He met with young farmers, promoting the importance of sustainable agriculture and emphasizing that the success of the program depended not just on production, but on education. He introduced the Sowing the Future campaign, which focused on training young people in modern agricultural practices and natural resources management. The goal was to create a generation of agricultural leaders who would continue to expand the program in the coming years. During a visit to Mali, he met Amadou, a young farmer who had abandoned his studies to help his family but was now receiving training in advanced irrigation techniques through the program. Amadou thanked Traoré for providing him a second chance. Traoré smiled, proud of the change he was seeing in the lives of the people. "You're already someone, Amadou," he said, "and you are proving that when we give people the right tools, they can conquer the world." As the program continued to expand across the region, international organizations began to recognize it as a model of sustainable development. Even some of Traoré's initial critics began to soften their stance, acknowledging the program's positive impact. Traoré was proving that with the right investments, Africa could take charge of its own future. In the weeks following the UN General Assembly's speech, Ibrahim Traoré's vision for rice for all was tested by mounting skepticism and logistical challenges. The world's focus was now on Burkina Faso's bold move towards self-sufficiency, and while his initiative was praised by some, it also faced fierce opposition. Economists and experts in international development questioned the viability of such an ambitious project, with many highlighting the huge infrastructure investments required to produce enough rice for export. Critics raised concerns about the country's limited resources, inadequate irrigation systems, and the lack of advanced farming technology to support such large-scale production. Despite this, Traoré remained undeterred. He recognized that the path to change was not going to be easy, but he also knew that if Burkina Faso could overcome these hurdles, it would set an example for the rest of Africa. In a press conference addressing the growing criticism, Traoré maintained his calm resolve. He acknowledged the challenges but emphasized that his government had already started seeing positive results from the community farms that were being developed across the country. "We know the challenges ahead," Traoré said, "but we are already seeing progress. Our local farmers are producing more rice, and the yields are steadily increasing. We are not asking for permission from anyone. We are taking control of our future, and we are building it together." His words resonated with many African leaders who were tired of foreign dependence and seeking ways to empower local communities. However, Trump's administration in the U.S. was less than impressed. The idea that an African country could supersede U.S. aid was seen as a direct challenge to American dominance on the continent. The U.S. had long held sway over Africa with its food aid programs, and now Traoré's audacious move threatened to upset the existing geopolitical landscape. Back in Washington, President Trump ordered an immediate review of U.S. policy in Africa. His administration was committed to maintaining control over the food aid system, which had been a powerful tool for influencing African nations. Trump's team argued that rice for all was impractical and would never succeed without continued American assistance. Trump, himself, was clearly troubled by Traoré's words. "This is an insult," Trump said during a meeting with his advisors. "We've helped these countries for years, and now they want to do this on their own." His frustration was palpable. Trump's advisors, meanwhile, were more measured in their responses, explaining that Burkina Faso's initiative was not about replacing U.S. aid but about Africa's right to self-sufficiency. They urged the president to adopt a more collaborative approach, suggesting that it might be wise to offer support for the program, given its potential. But Trump remained unconvinced. His administration, historically averse to funding initiatives that were seen as competition to American interests, was not ready to endorse Traoré's initiative. In the face of international criticism and geopolitical resistance, Traoré pressed on with his vision for Burkina Faso's self-sufficiency. He knew that the Rice for All program would face challenges, but he remained convinced that sustainable growth and self-reliance were necessary for the future of his country and the entire African continent. Traoré understood that the success of the program didn't just lie in agriculture but also in the education and training of the local population. He emphasized the importance of empowering young farmers with the tools and knowledge they needed to succeed. The Sowing the Future campaign was launched, which focused on teaching modern farming techniques and sustainable land management practices. The goal was to create a new generation of farmers who could not only improve their own communities but also help to expand the program to other regions. During a visit to Mali, Traoré met Amadou, a young farmer who had abandoned his studies to help his family. Thanks to the Rice for All program, Amadou was learning new farming techniques and advanced irrigation methods. Traoré smiled proudly when Amadou thanked him for giving him a new chance. The president was deeply moved by the transformation he saw in Amadou and many others like him who had been given the opportunity to work in agriculture rather than migrate to other countries in search of work. "You're already someone, Amadou," Traoré said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "And you are proving that when we give people the right tools, they can conquer the world." The program was gaining traction, and as it expanded, it began to draw international attention. Humanitarian and environmental organizations started to praise the program for its sustainable development model. Burkina Faso had become a beacon of hope for Africa, demonstrating that self-sufficiency was not just a pipe dream, it was a tangible goal. At the same time, the U.S. administration was still suspicious of the program's success. They viewed it as a direct threat to American influence in Africa, and Trump ordered an evaluation of the program's impact on the region. Despite this, many African leaders were beginning to rally behind Traoré, seeing his initiative as a bold step towards economic independence. Burkina Faso's success was not just about rice production. It was about shifting the narrative, changing the perception of Africa from a continent dependent on aid to a continent capable of self-reliance. The program was about building Africa's future with local resources, empowering communities, and ultimately redefining Africa's role on the world stage. By gaining the support of neighboring countries like Mali, Niger, and Ivory Coast, the Rice for All program began to expand regionally, supported by small local farmers and investments in sustainable agricultural technology. Traoré had created a network of agricultural cooperatives to ensure that the profits stayed local, keeping the wealth in the hands of local farmers instead of multinational corporations. The African Union took notice of Traoré's work and began to highlight the program as an example of African leadership. Many African presidents praised his efforts during a summit, recognizing the program as an important step toward economic sovereignty and a future where Africa could feed itself. While Burkina Faso's Rice for All program began gaining regional and international attention, Donald Trump continued to view the initiative with skepticism. He was not used to seeing African nations stand independently without U.S. aid. Trump's belief in the U.S.' role as a global leader made him uncomfortable with the idea that an African country was self-sustaining without help from the West. Trump's rhetoric became sharper. He couldn't fathom that a small African country like Burkina Faso could challenge decades of American dominance in the continent's food security efforts. He spoke about the program with dismissive language, questioning how long it would last without U.S. intervention. However, the response from Burkina Faso's leaders and many African leaders was one of unity and support for Traoré's vision. African countries, long dependent on foreign aid, now saw Traoré's leadership as a beacon of hope. Traoré's unwavering confidence in self-sufficiency had not only inspired his own people but had created a new paradigm for the continent. Traoré was aware of the political challenges ahead, but his vision for Africa feeding itself resonated deeply with citizens, young farmers, and leaders across the continent. Even those who initially doubted the program began to see its potential as African cooperation grew stronger. The program quickly spread across neighboring regions like Mali, Ivory Coast, and Niger, and local farmers in these countries were starting to see a rise in production as well. It wasn't just about rice. It was about rebuilding economies and ensuring that local farmers could feed their own communities without the need for external support. For Traoré, this was just the beginning. He continued to meet with local farmers, offering training and sustainable farming solutions, while also exploring ways to expand the program to other regions in Africa. His work was now about creating a legacy of empowerment, where Africa could stand shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the world, not as a continent of dependency, but as a continent of prosperity and self-reliance. As Burkina Faso's Rice for All program continued to gain momentum, Ibrahim Traoré's leadership was increasingly recognized on the global stage. The initiative, which began as a bold step toward self-sufficiency and economic independence, was now expanding to neighboring countries such as Mali, Niger, and Ivory Coast. The program was no longer just a Burkina Faso project, it had become a regional movement, supported by small local farmers, grassroots organizations, and even some African governments. In Mali, Traoré visited several rural communities to observe firsthand how the program was being implemented. He was encouraged by what he saw. Local farmers were learning new sustainable farming techniques through the Sowing the Future campaign, which provided training in modern agricultural practices and natural resource management. The farmers were thriving, not only producing enough food for their families but also generating surplus crops that were being sold in local markets. One young farmer Traoré met during his visit was Amadou, a former student who had dropped out of school to help his family after a difficult period. With the launch of the Rice for All initiative, Amadou was now receiving advanced training in irrigation and harvesting techniques. His story was one of many, demonstrating how the program was providing young people with new opportunities in agriculture. Amadou's face lit up with pride as he spoke to Traoré. "Mr. President, I have a new chance now. I can dream of becoming someone who can help my country." Traoré smiled, placing his hand on Amadou's shoulder, encouraged by the transformation he had witnessed. The expansion of the program across West Africa was not without challenges, but the positive feedback from local communities and young farmers was undeniable. Traoré had set out to reshape Africa's future, and he was seeing the fruits of his labor take root. The initiative was about much more than just food. It was about creating a new generation of farmers, entrepreneurs, and leaders who would contribute to Africa's sustainable growth. As Traoré returned to Burkina Faso, the program's success was becoming increasingly apparent. In Ivory Coast, Niger, and other neighboring nations, governments were starting to take notice of the economic opportunities that the Rice for All initiative provided. Traoré's leadership was now inspiring a broader movement across Africa, one that encouraged self-reliance, economic empowerment, and a rejection of foreign aid dependency. As the success of Burkina Faso's Rice for All program spread across West Africa, the global attention on Traoré's initiative only intensified. The program was becoming a beacon of hope for Africa's self-sufficiency, and international organizations, especially those focused on sustainable development and food security, began to praise its approach. Humanitarian and environmental groups acknowledged that the program was more than just a food aid replacement. It was a model for economic empowerment and environmentally responsible agriculture. However, Donald Trump remained skeptical. As the program expanded, he continued to view it with suspicion, seeing it as a challenge to U.S. influence in Africa. While U.S. food aid programs had been a cornerstone of America's relationship with African countries for decades, Traoré's program had made it clear that African nations were no longer willing to be bound by foreign intervention. Despite Trump's objections, African leaders began to rally behind the Rice for All initiative. Several African Union (AU) meetings saw leaders from Mali, Niger, Ivory Coast, and other countries praising Traoré's bold leadership. They recognized the value of his program as a path toward true economic sovereignty. For them, Burkina Faso's example was proving that Africa could stand on its own and become a global leader in agricultural innovation. In a summit held in Addis Ababa, several presidents discussed the potential of replicating Traoré's model in their own countries. During his speech, one African leader remarked, "He is proving that Africa can feed itself." The collective sentiment among the leaders was clear: the Rice for All program was more than a food security initiative, it was a movement that could reshape Africa's economic landscape. Meanwhile, Traoré continued his efforts to expand the program and educate local communities. He launched a campaign to train young farmers in sustainable agricultural practices. His message was consistent: Africa had the potential to thrive without relying on external assistance. In community farms across West Africa, young farmers were learning how to maximize land use, conserve natural resources, and implement more efficient irrigation techniques. Back in Washington, Trump's concerns about losing influence in Africa only deepened. As more countries began to express support for Burkina Faso's initiative, the U.S. found itself in an uncomfortable position. Trump's team analyzed the situation, looking for ways to maintain U.S. dominance in the region. But the growing unity among African countries, rallying around Traoré's self-sufficiency model, was a force that couldn't be easily reversed. The shift was undeniable. Traoré's program was not just about food production, it was about reclaiming Africa's dignity, its ability to make its own decisions, and to chart a path towards a more equitable future. This transformation, while facing resistance from external powers like the U.S., was slowly changing the narrative about Africa's potential. As Burkina Faso marked the 5-year anniversary of the Rice for All program, the country was celebrating significant milestones. The initiative had not only provided food security but had also fostered economic independence across the region. The program was a model for sustainable agriculture, empowering local communities and transforming rural economies. At a celebratory ceremony, Ibrahim Traoré addressed a crowd of farmers, young people, and international representatives. He reflected on the challenges the program had overcome and the doubts that had surrounded its viability. "When we started this program," Traoré said, his voice thick with emotion, "many doubted us. They said it was impossible, that we were dreaming too loud. But here we are, proving that when we work together, there is no limit to what we can achieve." Amadou, the young farmer Traoré had met in Mali, took the stage to speak. He had gone from an unemployed student to one of the main coordinators of the agricultural cooperatives. He thanked Traoré for providing him with the opportunity to learn advanced farming techniques. "Now, thanks to this program, I have a purpose," Amadou said. "And now, others have the chance to find their own purpose too." Traoré's vision for self-sufficiency had taken root, and the success of the program was now evident. Africa, once thought to be dependent on aid, was feeding itself, proving that with the right tools, knowledge, and collaboration, the continent could overcome its reliance on external powers. As the program continued to expand, it inspired other African nations to take similar steps toward self-reliance, marking a new era in Africa's development. The world had witnessed something remarkable. Burkina Faso had not only transformed its own future but had shown the world that true greatness comes from creating local solutions to global problems. The success of the Rice for All program was more than a national victory, it was a global symbol of the power of self-sufficiency and empowerment. The success of Burkina Faso's Rice for All program continued to reverberate throughout Africa and beyond, creating a ripple effect that challenged the traditional model of foreign aid and dependence. As the program expanded, more African leaders began to take notice. Traoré's vision of an Africa that could feed itself, built on local resources and self-sufficiency, had gained significant traction not just in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. During a pivotal African Union summit, several heads of state shared their support for the program. President Traoré was hailed as a beacon of African leadership and innovation. Leaders from Mali, Niger, and Ivory Coast praised Burkina Faso's commitment to economic sovereignty. They recognized that the Rice for All initiative was more than just about food security, it was a new blueprint for development that could empower African nations to take control of their futures. As African countries began to see the potential in the program, many started to consider replicating it in their own regions. Traoré's bold stance had provided a tangible example of self-reliance, one that didn't require dependence on Western aid. In his speech at the summit, one African leader remarked, "He is proving that Africa can feed itself." This sentiment resonated with many, sparking a continent-wide conversation about redefining Africa's economic landscape and embracing homegrown solutions. For Traoré, this was the beginning of a Pan-African movement. He knew that economic transformation couldn't be achieved in isolation. The Rice for All program, while successful in Burkina Faso, needed to be integrated into a broader vision of regional cooperation. He began holding meetings with regional agricultural cooperatives and national governments to explore the possibilities for a Pan-African network that could share resources, exchange knowledge, and support one another in achieving food security across the continent. The program also began to attract investment from African banks and institutions, signaling a growing commitment to homegrown solutions. As African nations began to make strategic investments in agriculture, young people across the continent were inspired to see farming not just as a way of life, but as a profession with economic potential. This shift was reflected in the growing interest in agriculture in schools, universities, and communities. Meanwhile, international attention on the program continued to grow. Humanitarian organizations, once critical of the program, began to see it as a sustainable model for development. Traoré's efforts were proving that self-sufficiency wasn't just an idealistic goal, it was a practical solution to the challenges Africa faced. As the Rice for All program marked its 5th anniversary, its success was undeniable. Burkina Faso had overcome many obstacles, and now the program stood as a testament to the power of self-sufficiency and local empowerment. The initial skepticism surrounding the initiative had transformed into global recognition. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had not only changed Burkina Faso but had become a symbol for Africa's potential. During a ceremonial event, Traoré addressed a crowd composed of farmers, youth, community leaders, and international representatives. His voice, once filled with the passion of a young leader, now carried the weight of achievement. He reflected on the journey, the challenges, and the doubts, but he also celebrated the tangible changes that had been made. Amadou, the young farmer Traoré had met in Mali, now stood on stage as one of the program's main coordinators, training new generations of farmers in sustainable practices. Traoré invited him to speak, and Amadou's words resonated deeply with the crowd. "Thanks to this program, I now have a purpose, and I can help others find theirs." The crowd erupted in applause, and Traoré's smile showed how far they had come together. The program, now expanding across several African nations, was no longer just about food production. It was about transforming lives, building communities, and proving that Africa could thrive on its own terms. Traoré's message was clear: true transformation comes not from relying on foreign aid, but from empowering local people to build a brighter future. In that moment, Traoré realized that the legacy of the program was not just in the rice fields, it was in the lives changed, the opportunities created, and the hope restored for future generations across Africa.